In 1996, a Russian historian counting graves outside a small town found a figure that could not be right. What the Soviet Union had left out of its own war history would overturn everything the world believed about how the Eastern Front was actually fought. The town was Rzhev, about 200 kilometers west of Moscow, and the fighting around it ran from January of 1942 to March of 1943. 4 separate Soviet offensives were launched to take it. Every one failed. Modern estimates put Soviet casualties across those operations somewhere between 1 and 2 million men. 2 million is more than the Western Allies lost in the entire war. It is more than Stalingrad. It is more than Kursk. It is more than the Normandy campaign and the Italian campaign and the Battle of the Bulge combined. And almost nobody outside Russia has heard the name of the place. Soviet war history was a genre with a fixed shape, and it was written while the men who fought were still alive. The narrative ran from catastrophe to recovery to triumph. Moscow held. Stalingrad turned the tide. Kursk broke the panzers. Berlin fell. Each battle was a step in a sequence that ended in victory, and every operation in the official histories exists to move that sequence forward. The Great Patriotic War was taught in schools, filmed, and carved into monuments across a continent. Rzhev is not in a single volume of any of it. The operations were never given a collective name in Soviet historiography. No campaign title, no commemorative medal, no mention in the standard multi-volume histories published through the 1960s and 70s. Marshal Zhukov, who commanded there, devotes a few pages of his memoirs to it and does not call it a defeat. No monument until this century. No line in the standard chronology. No entry in the encyclopedias. No place on the map of the war that Soviet schoolchildren were shown. The archives that would have settled the casualty figures stayed closed until the 1990s. And when they opened, the numbers were so far above the published totals that the first historians to print them were accused of inventing them. Veterans who had been there had spent 50 years describing a battle that officially had no name. Veterans who had been there spent 50 years describing a battle that officially had no name and appeared on no map of the war. Somebody made the decision to leave it out. Somebody decided 1 million men were a gap rather than a chapter. Somebody kept that decision through 4 changes of government. The soldiers themselves are the second erasure, and the more complete one. Rzhev is where the term meat grinder entered Russian usage as a description of a specific place. Units were fed into frontal assaults across open, waterlogged ground, against prepared German positions, in some cases repeatedly, in some cases on the same axis a matter of days apart. The dead were often not recovered, because the ground stayed contested, and then the front moved on, and search teams working the forests around the town are still recovering remains today at a rate of thousands per year. Most come out without identification. The men who died there did not merely lose their battle, they lost their names, their unit records, and the acknowledgement that they had been in a battle at all, which raises a question about the whole of the Eastern Front, rather than one town in it. If an operation costing more than the entire Western Allied war effort could be left out of the official account for 50 years, then the shape of that front, as it is generally understood, is not a shape drawn by events. It is a shape drawn by an editor, and the editor is nowhere in it. A front that swallowed most of Germany's casualties is understood in the West through a handful of named battles, and the naming was done by a state with reasons of its own. How many other operations went the same way? And what does the ratio between the two theaters actually look like once they are put back? Nobody has settled it. The casualty figures are still argued over in the Russian literature, and the range spans 1 million men. Somebody decided 1 million men were a gap. A memorial was finally opened at Rzhev in 2020, 77 years after the fighting ended, and the soldier it depicts has no name because almost none of them do. Number 2. The Offensive. On the 9th of August. Number 9. The Offensive on the 9th of August. On the 9th of August, in 1945, 1.5 million men crossed a border, and most accounts of that week leave it out. What that offensive did to Japan's position would dismantle everything the post-war world was taught about why the Pacific War ended when it did. Operation August Storm opened 3 days after Hiroshima and on the same day as Nagasaki, Soviet forces attacked across a front of more than 4,000 kilometers into Manchuria, Korea, Sakhalin, and the Kurils against the Kwantung Army. Within days, the Japanese position had collapsed. The operation is one of the largest single campaigns of the entire war, by frontage and by men committed. 2 atomic bombs are the story every school teaches. Not one bomb in an invasion. Not a collapse on the mainland. Not the loss of the last neutral power Japan had been counting on to broker terms. And not a Soviet army arriving on the Asian mainland at the exact moment the Japanese cabinet was deciding whether to surrender. The bomb ending the war is one of the most widely held beliefs about the 20th century. It appears in textbooks, in documentaries, in political argument about nuclear weapons, and in the moral case made for and against their use ever since. The sequence is presented as a clean causal chain. Hiroshima on the 6th, Nagasaki on the 9th, surrender on the 15th. 2 weapons in 1 week, and the argument about whether it was justified takes that chain as given, before it even starts. The Soviet declaration falls inside that same week, and Japan's own record of the decision does not read the way the chain requires. The Supreme Council met on the morning of the 9th, before news of Nagasaki reached them, and the meeting had been called because of the Soviet entry. Japanese strategy through the summer had rested on Moscow remaining neutral and mediating a negotiated peace, because the Soviets had a non-aggression pact and had not renounced it in a way that Tokyo treated as final. That entire diplomatic track vanished overnight. The Army's plan for the defense of the home islands assumed forces available in Manchuria that were now engaged and losing. Some Japanese officials at the time, and some historians since, have argued that the Soviet entry was the more decisive shock, on the grounds that the fire raids had already destroyed more of Japan than either atomic bomb and had not produced surrender. The pact was gone. The mediator was gone. The Manchurian reserve was gone. Somebody made a decision in Tokyo that week. Somebody was weighing 2 events at once. Somebody wrote it down, and the record is not as tidy as the version that got taught. The post-war reasons for the tidiness are documented rather than suspected. The United States had every reason to present the bomb as decisive, because that framing justified the expenditure, the secrecy, and the use, and because within 2 years, the Soviet Union was an adversary whose contribution nobody in Washington wished to emphasize. The Soviet Union had its own reasons to present the campaign as a triumph of arms rather than as opportunism at the end of a war it had joined late in Asia. Both accounts were serving something. The version that reached Western classrooms was assembled in a period when one of the 2 participants had become the enemy, and it has not been substantially revised since, which leaves the causal question genuinely open in the literature and completely closed everywhere else. Historians have argued both readings for decades with access to the same Japanese cabinet records, and no consensus has formed in 80 years of trying. The people who read the documents are less certain than the people who teach the outcome, which is the reverse of how that usually runs. A school child gets a settled answer to a question specialists have failed to settle in 80 years, and the settling was done outside the archive. What ended the war? And why does a question specialists treat as unresolved appear in school books as settled fact? Nobody teaching it is lying. The bomb was real, it was used, and it is in the record. Somebody was weighing 2 events at once. 80 years on, the campaign that put 1.5 million men across a 4,000-kilometer front in the last week of the war is a footnote in the country that fought against it, and the argument about why Japan surrendered is still being had by the people who read the documents. Number 3. Hong Kong, 8 hours early. Number 8. Hong Kong, 8 hours early. On the 8th of December in 1941, a garrison in Asia went to war 8 hours before Pearl Harbor was attacked. What happened to the men holding Hong Kong over the following 17 days would overturn everything the standard account says about when and where the Pacific War began. The colony had a garrison of about 14,000, including 2 Canadian battalions that had arrived 3 weeks earlier without their vehicles, Indian units, British regulars, and the Hong Kong Volunteer Defense Corps. Japanese forces crossed the border on the morning of the 8th. The mainland positions fell in 5 days. The island held out until Christmas. Christmas Day is when it surrendered. Not a token resistance, not a garrison that quit when the mainland fell. Not a footnote to Pearl Harbor, because the fighting started first and ran 17 days longer. And not a battle in anybody's popular account except Canada's. Pearl Harbor is where the Pacific War is understood to have started, and the date is fixed in the language. A day that will live in infamy, the 7th of December. The whole periodization of the American War runs from that morning, and the entry of the United States is treated as the moment the conflict became global. Everything before it is prologue, and the Asian War that had been running since 1937 is compressed into background. The first shots of that war were fired somewhere else, and the garrison that fired them was defending a position that had already been written off. British planning had assessed Hong Kong as indefensible against a determined Japanese attack years earlier. No relief was possible. No fleet was coming. No air cover existed after the first day, because the handful of aircraft on the island were destroyed on the ground. The Canadians had been sent as a political gesture toward deterrence, arriving in November with no transport and limited training in the terrain. What followed the surrender is the part that vanished most completely. Prisoners were killed at the Salesian Mission and at St. Stephen's College, where wounded men and medical staff were bayoneted in the hospital. Survivors spent nearly 4 years in camps, with a death rate that ran far above the European average. No relief force was ever assembled. No evacuation of the garrison was ever attempted. No account of the killings at St. Stephen's reached the public in any detail for years. Somebody sent them there knowing. Somebody assessed the position as indefensible and reinforced it anyway. Somebody's had to decide what to tell the families. The Canadian part of it took 50 years to surface at home. Nearly 2,000 Canadians were sent, and roughly a quarter of them died in the fighting or afterward in the camps, which is a casualty rate comparable to the worst engagements of the European theater. They were the first Canadian ground troops to fight in the Second World War. A royal commission held during the war examined how they came to be sent and produced findings that satisfied nobody. Veterans campaigned for decades for recognition and for compensation over their treatment as prisoners. And the compensation came in 1998, 57 years after the surrender, by which point most of the men it was meant for were dead. Which is a particular kind of erasure, because nothing was hidden and everything was available. The records existed. The survivors were alive and talking. What was missing was any national account with a shape that could hold a defeat at the very start, fought by troops sent to a place their own planners had already condemned. A war needs a beginning that works as a story, and a garrison losing a colony it was told it could not hold does not work as one. How many opening defeats got folded into the background this way? And who decides where a war is said to begin? The men there knew where it began. Hong Kong is remembered in Canada, at Saiwan Cemetery, and almost nowhere else, and the anniversary that gets marked every December is the one that happened 8 hours later across the Pacific. Somebody assessed the position as indefensible and reinforced it anyway. The Pacific War opened with a 17-day battle, and the country that lost most in it has spent 80 years getting nobody to notice. Number 4. The castle where the sides swapped. Number 7. The castle where the sides swapped. In May of 1945, an American tank commander agreed to fight alongside the men he had spent 3 years fighting. What happened at an Austrian castle over the next 2 days would dismantle everything the war has ever been used to teach about who the sides actually were. Schloss Itter in the Tyrol was a prison holding French political figures, among them 2 former prime ministers and a former commander-in-chief. The SS guards had gone. An advancing Waffen-SS unit was moving on the castle. The garrison that assembled to hold it consisted of 14 American soldiers, 1 Sherman tank, a handful of freed prisoners, and a Wehrmacht major with about a dozen of his own men. Nothing about that arrangement has a precedent. Not Germans surrendering, not Germans deserting, not a local truce at the end of a collapsing front, not prisoners fighting, and not American and German soldiers loading each other's weapons and holding a wall together against a third German unit while the war still had a week to run. Sides are the one thing the war is never ambiguous about. The whole structure of how it is taught, filmed, and remembered rests on a clean division: Allied and Axis, us and them. Individual Germans may be shown as decent, and individual Allied soldiers as flawed, but the line itself never moves. because the moral clarity of the conflict depends on it holding. Every other war produces stories of switched sides and shifting alliances. This one is presented as the exception. And at Itter, that line moved for 2 whole days. Major Josef Gongol had already stopped fighting the Allies before the Americans arrived. He had made contact with the Austrian resistance and was using his remaining men to protect civilians from the SS. And when word reached him that Itter was threatened, he went looking for American forces to help. He found Captain John Lee of the 12th Armored Division. Lee took a tank and a handful of men, drove to the castle, and put Gongol's soldiers into the defense alongside his own. The Sherman was knocked out early in the fighting. The defenders included a tennis champion, a former prime minister firing from a window, and German soldiers who had been enemy combatants the previous morning and who would be enemy combatants again if the war lasted another fortnight. Gongol was killed by a sniper while pulling a French politician out of a line of fire. No orders authorized any of it. No plan existed for it. No procedure covered what anybody was supposed to do about it afterward. Somebody changed sides that week. Somebody died doing it. Somebody is buried in Austria as a national hero of a country he had been occupying. The battle went almost entirely unrecorded, and the reason is structural rather than deliberate. It happened in the first week of May in 1945, in the same days as the fall of Berlin, the death of Hitler, the opening of the camps, and the German surrender. No newspaper on earth had column space for a 14-man action at a castle in the Tyrol that week. The unit records exist and always have. The French politicians wrote their memoirs and published them. Nothing was classified and nothing was denied. But the story never entered the standard narrative, and by the time anybody examined it properly, the war had been packaged into a shape with no slot for it. It is not that Itter was hidden. Nothing was ever built to hold it, which is a different kind of erasure, and probably a far more common one. History is not only edited by governments with something to hide, it is edited by what fits the frame that has already been built, and a 2-day action in which Germans and Americans fought side by side will not fit a frame organized entirely around 2 sides. Nothing about it had to be suppressed by anybody, and nobody has ever claimed otherwise. It simply had nowhere to go, and a story with nowhere to go disappears just as completely as one that is buried. How many events were lost that way instead of hidden? And what is the war we were taught the wrong shape of? Nobody went looking for the others. Itter surfaced only because the men inside the castle were famous enough that their memoirs got printed. Somebody changed sides that week. The last battle in Europe in which American and German soldiers fought together is documented, verifiable, and absent from almost every account of the war, and it survived because a former prime minister happened to be standing in the room. Number 5. The army that was cropped out. Number 6. The army that was cropped out. On a war grave register for a hill in northeast India, a researcher counted the nationalities of the dead and stopped. What the composition of that army says about the war would overturn everything the popular account has ever shown about who fought it. The hill was Kohima, held through April and May of 1944 against a Japanese offensive aimed at India. The fighting at one point ran across a district commissioner's tennis court, with the 2 sides occupying opposite ends of it. The force that held the line and then broke the offensive at Imphal was the British 14th Army, and roughly 80% of it was Indian and African. 80% is not a contingent, not an auxiliary force, not colonial troops in a supporting role behind a British spearhead, not a footnote to a British victory, because the army was overwhelmingly not British. And not what appears in a single popular film, poster, or classroom account of the campaign. The visual record of the war is almost entirely white, and it has been from the beginning. The footage, the recruitment posters, the post-war films, the anniversary photographs, the memorials in European capitals. When the Second World War is pictured, it is pictured as a war between European nations and their overseas cousins, fought by men who look like the people watching. Almost none of the men who actually fought appear anywhere in that picture. The largest volunteer army in history is not in the frame. 2.5 million Indians volunteered, the largest volunteer army ever raised anywhere, and more than 500,000 Africans served in British forces. No posters, no newsreels, no place in the parade. The absence was arranged rather than accidental in several documented cases. The victory parade held in Paris in 1944 was whitened deliberately, with African troops of the Free French forces removed from the units that marched, a process the French command referred to at the time in terms of blanchiment. Colonial troops who had fought through Italy and southern France were pulled out and replaced. Pay and pension scales differed by race in more than one Allied army, and in some cases, those differentials survived the war by decades. Veterans returning to colonies that were about to fight for independence found their service politically inconvenient to everybody, including the new governments. The memorials went up in London and Paris. Somebody drew up the marching order in Paris. Somebody set the pension rates. Somebody chose which photographs went into the archive and which ones stayed in the box. And there is a name attached to every one of those decisions somewhere in a file. The pattern held in the other direction too, which is what makes it structural. The war produced independence movements across Asia and Africa precisely because it demonstrated that the imperial powers could be beaten and that colonial troops could do the beating, and neither the departing empires nor the arriving national governments had much use for a story in which the crucial fighting was done by men serving under a foreign flag. The British account had no room for it because it complicated a national myth. The Indian and African accounts had limited room because it complicated theirs. Two sets of interests, pointing in opposite political directions, producing exactly the same silence between them. Neither side had to coordinate with the other to arrive at it, which is a reminder that erasure does not require a conspiracy, or even a decision anybody would recognize as one. It requires only that no constituency anywhere has a reason to remember, and after 1947 there was no such constituency on any continent. The men at Kohima are commemorated on a stone carrying one of the most quoted epitaphs of the entire war, and the overwhelming majority of the people who quote it have never once asked who the dead actually were. How many armies have been mispictured this way, and who was standing in the part of the frame that got cropped out? The register answers it, and almost nobody reads the register. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission lists names from across South Asia and East and West Africa on memorials from Burma to Italy running to hundreds of thousands. Somebody chose which photographs went into the archive. The epitaph at Kohima says that for their tomorrow we gave our today, and most of the men it speaks for came from somewhere else. Number 6. Wizna, 700 against 40,000. Number 5. Wizna, 700 against 40,000. In September of 1939, 720 Polish soldiers held a river crossing against a force 50 times their size. What happened at Wizna over the following 3 days would dismantle everything the world has ever been taught about how quickly Poland gave up. The position covered a stretch of the Tyrol River north of Warsaw, held by a reinforced company with about 6 anti-tank rifles, 2 anti-tank guns, and a handful of concrete bunkers that were unfinished. Against them came the German 19th Panzer Corps under Heinz Guderian, roughly 42,000 men with 350 tanks. The Poles held for 3 days. 3 days from a company against a corps is not a delaying action, not a skirmish, not a rearguard falling back on schedule, not what a collapsing army produces, because collapsing armies do not hold for 72 hours at 50-1, and not a battle in any general history written outside Poland. Poland collapsing in weeks is one of the fixed points of the war's opening. The campaign is taught as the demonstration of blitzkrieg, the moment the world learned what mechanized warfare could do, and the Polish army features in it mainly as the thing that was overrun. The cavalry charging tank story, which was German propaganda and never happened as described, still appears in popular accounts. The whole episode functions as a prologue that establishes German capability before the real war starts in the West. Poland fought for 5 weeks against 2 invasions. The arithmetic is not in the standard telling anywhere. Germany attacked on the 1st of September. The Soviet Union attacked from the east on the 17th, under the protocol attached to the pact signed in August, which put the Polish army between 2 forces with no possibility of falling back. Warsaw held until the 27th. The last regular formation surrendered on the 6th of October. That is longer than France would hold the following year with the British Expeditionary Force alongside it. Polish casualties ran to around 200,000, and Polish forces inflicted losses on the Wehrmacht heavy enough to require refit before the Western campaign. No account in general circulation gives the October date. No account gives the Soviet invasion equal weight. No account gives the German casualty figures. No account mentions Wizna. Somebody held that river for 3 days. Somebody was still fighting in October. Somebody worked out that the story needed a fast collapse, and the fast collapse is what got printed. The reason the correction never arrived is that nobody was in a position to make it. Poland spent the war under occupation, and the following 45 years under a government that had every reason to emphasize the Soviet liberation and none at all to dwell on the Soviet invasion of 1939, which was official policy to describe as something else. Polish forces that fought on in the West, at Monte Cassino, in the Battle of Britain, at Arnhem, were excluded from the London Victory Parade in 1946 for diplomatic reasons. The Polish account of 1939 existed continuously in Polish, in exile publications, and in private, and simply did not cross into the general history in any language for half a century. Which means the opening of the war is understood through a version that suited two occupying powers at once. Germany needed the campaign to look effortless because that was the deterrent. The Soviet Union needed its own half of the invasion to disappear entirely. The version that survived was the one both invaders found useful, and the people it was about spent the next half-century unable to publish a correction anybody outside would read. How much of the standard account of September 1939 was written by the people who invaded it, and what would it read like otherwise? It reads differently in Warsaw and always has. The Wizna position was commanded by Captain Władysław Reginis, who had sworn to hold it while he was alive, and who killed himself with a grenade in the last bunker rather than surrender. Somebody held that river for 3 days. There is a monument on that hill, and it is almost never visited by anybody who is not Polish. Number 7. The Fiery Land. Number 4. The Fiery Land. In November of 1943, Soviet troops crossed a freezing strait in fishing boats and landed on a beach nobody has heard of. What happened to the men who got ashore at Eltigen would overturn everything the Western world assumes about how amphibious warfare was actually fought. The Kerch and Eltigen operation put Soviet forces across the Kerch Strait into German-held Crimea, using naval infantry, requisitioned civilian craft, and no purpose-built landing ships of any kind. The Eltigen bridgehead was cut off almost immediately. It held for 36 days, supplied only by air, and the men in it gave the position a name. They called it the Fiery Land, not a code name issued by a staff, not a designation from an operational order, not a title given afterward by a historian, because the men who named it mostly did not survive to be interviewed, and not a phrase that appears in any English language account of the war. Amphibious operations are a Western story in the way the war is generally told. Normandy, Anzio, Sicily, Salerno, Iwo Jima, Tarawa, Okinawa, the specialized craft, the beach obstacles, the naval gunfire support, the whole vocabulary of the opposed landing comes from the Anglo-American operations, and the Pacific Island campaigns supply the images. Soviet forces are pictured on the steppe, in tanks, at Stalingrad and Kursk and Berlin, fighting a land war on a continental front. Soviet forces ran 150 amphibious landings. Almost none of them have names in English. No standard reference lists them together. No translated operational history covers the series. No Western staff college teaches them, and the largest of them moved tens of thousands of men across water under fire using improvised means, which is exactly the problem Western planners spent years and enormous industrial resources solving with purpose-built ships. The Soviet answer was fishing boats, barges, and casualties. At Eltigen, the survivors eventually broke out overland, rather than waiting for an evacuation nobody could mount, took a hill above Kerch, and held that instead until they were relieved. The operational reports exist in Russian archives. Some were classified for decades because the losses were politically awkward. The Eltigen force went in with no naval gunfire support worth the name, no specialized craft, and no realistic plan for evacuation if the bridgehead was cut. It was cut on the first night and stayed cut. Nothing came in but aircraft. Nothing went out at all. Somebody crossed that water in a fishing boat. Somebody held for 36 days on airdrops. Somebody named the place while standing on it. The language barrier is doing more work here than any censor did. Western histories of the war were written predominantly by Western authors working in Western archives, in a period when Soviet archives were closed and Soviet publications were regarded as propaganda, which they frequently were. What resulted was not suppression but a division of labor that nobody planned. Each side wrote the war it had actually fought, and read very little of the others. Neither was concealing anything. Both were simply working from what they had. Then the Cold War hardened that separation for another 40 years, and the general account of the conflict in English settled into a shape before most of the Eastern material could have been read even by someone who wanted to. Which means the standard history has a structural gap rather than a set of missing entries. It is not that particular Soviet operations were left out of a complete account. It is that the account itself was assembled from one half of the sources and then treated as the whole thing. The gap is in the reading rather than the evidence, and a gap in the reading does not close by itself. Nobody has to hide anything for half a war to go missing. Somebody only has to not translate it. How many operations are sitting in Russian archives with no English name attached to them? And what would the war look like written from both halves at once? Nobody has written that book. Translation of Soviet operational material remains patchy. The archives have opened and partially closed again, and the standard English narrative of the war has not been rebuilt from the ground up. Somebody named the place while standing on it. There is ground in Crimea that the men who died on it called the Fiery Land, and the phrase has never once appeared in an English textbook. Number 8. The 3rd of Okinawa Nobody Counted. Number 3. The 3rd of Okinawa Nobody Counted. In a cave on Okinawa in June of 1945, a family died together without a single American soldier being present. What happened to the civilian population of that island would dismantle everything the standard account records about who the battle actually killed. The battle ran for 82 days, and the military figures are well known. Around 12,000 American dead. Around 77,000 Japanese soldiers. The civilian figure is estimated at between 100,000 and 150,000 people, which is somewhere between a quarter and a third of the pre-war population of the island. A third of a population is not collateral damage, not an ordinary consequence of urban fighting, not a figure comparable to anything else in the Pacific, not a number anybody ever established, because no census survived, and not something the standard account reports at all. Battles are counted in soldiers, and the convention is so deep it is invisible. Casualty tables list units: killed, wounded, missing. Comparative accounts weigh one engagement against another using military losses. Okinawa appears in that framework as the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, and the number quoted to support that is almost always the combined military total of roughly 90,000. The convention is not sinister. It is what armies record, because armies count their own. The civilians outnumbered both armies combined. Nothing in the standard reporting structure had a place to put them. No unit rolls, no casualty returns, no graves registration for people who were not in anybody's service. The deaths came from artillery, from being caught between positions, from starvation, and from a category that the reporting conventions have no field for at all, which is compelled group suicide. Japanese forces had told the population that surrender meant torture and death, and in numerous documented cases distributed grenades to families. Whole groups died in caves. The Japanese term used at the time translates roughly as death for the sake of honor, and Japanese textbooks have argued over the wording of those passages in court, because how the deaths are described determines whether they were coerced. There were no unit rolls for a family in a cave. There was no next of kin telegram to send. There was no column for any of it in any return filed by either army, and no clerk anywhere whose job it was to add them up. Somebody handed out the grenades. Somebody wrote the textbook line. Somebody is still litigating the verb. The islanders were not quite anybody's people, which is the part that persists. Okinawa had been an independent kingdom annexed by Japan in the 19th century, its language suppressed and its population treated as marginal. And during the battle, Okinawan civilians were in some documented cases killed by Japanese soldiers on suspicion of spying, sometimes for speaking their own language. After the war, the islands remained under American administration until 1972, and the American military presence there remains a live political issue today. So the dead belonged to a population that Japan had absorbed, that the United States then governed, and that neither has ever quite counted as its own. which is why the number stays a range instead of becoming a figure. Precise counts require somebody with an institutional reason to count, and no institution has had one. 80 years on, the estimate still spans 50,000 people, which is more than the total military dead on either side. A range that wide is not a measurement of anything. It is an admission that nobody counted at the time, and nobody since has managed it. The military figures for the same battle are given to the nearest 100. How do you lose 50,000 people from a total? And who was ever supposed to have written them down? Nobody was assigned to. The cornerstone of Peace Memorial at Itaman lists names of all the dead of the battle regardless of nationality, which is unusual, and its inscriptions continue to be added to as identifications are made. Somebody is still litigating the verb. The bloodiest battle of the Pacific War is remembered by a number that leaves out the majority of the people it killed. Number 9. Changsha 4 times. Number 2. Changsha 4 times. 4 times between 1939 and 1944, a Japanese army marched on the same Chinese city and was thrown back. What happened at Changsha across those 5 years would overturn everything the Western account records about who was actually holding Japan down. The city sits on the Xiang River in Hunan, and it was the objective of 4 separate Japanese offensives. Chinese forces under Shuiyue defeated the first 3, using a defensive method that drew attacking columns into a pocket around the city and then closed on them. The third battle in 1941 was won while the Pacific War was 3 weeks old. 3 defensive victories in a row is not a holding action, not a stalemate, not attrition nobody won because somebody won it 3 times, not a sideshow because it pinned divisions needed elsewhere, and not a battle that appears anywhere in the English account of the war. The China theater exists in the Western telling as background rather than as a front. The war is taught as beginning in 1939 in Europe, with the Pacific added in 1941. And China appears mainly as the place Japan was already bogged down before the story starts. The Flying Tigers get a mention. The Burma Road gets a mention. Chinese forces themselves appear as a mass being aided rather than as armies fighting battles with commanders and plans and outcomes. Japan kept most of its army in China for the entire war. The proportion is the fact that reorganizes everything around it. Through most of the conflict, well over half of Japanese ground strength was committed to the China theater against Chinese forces, and it stayed there while the United States fought its way across the Pacific island by island. Those divisions were not available for anything else. That is not a background detail. It is the reason the Pacific Campaign was fought against the army that was left over. Chinese casualties across the war run into many millions, and the estimates are still contested by a margin larger than most nations lost in total. The fighting began in 1937, 2 years before Poland, which means the conventional start date of the Second World War is a European start date that has been applied to a global war. No campaign histories in English, no named commanders in circulation, no place in the standard chronology for any of the 4 battles, or for the dozens of engagements around them across 8 years of continuous fighting, or for the men who fought all of it. Somebody held that river 4 times. Somebody kept those divisions occupied for 8 years. Somebody paid for it in numbers that nobody has ever finished counting. The reasons the theater disappeared are political, and they arrived after the fighting ended. The Chinese forces that won at Changsha were nationalist, and within 4 years of the Japanese surrender, the nationalist government had lost the Civil War and withdrawn to Taiwan. The victors on the mainland had no interest in commemorating nationalist victories, and the United States, which had backed the nationalists, had limited appetite for celebrating the achievements of a government it had just watched collapse. So the campaigns had no sponsor on either side of the new divide. A theater that ran for 8 years and absorbed the bulk of an enemy army had, by 1950, nobody left with a reason to teach it, which puts a question under the whole periodization of the war. If the fighting started in 1937 and the largest sustained commitment of Japanese ground forces was against China throughout, then the standard timeline and the standard weighting are both artifacts of who wrote the account afterward. A start date is never a neutral fact. It decides whose losses count as being inside the war and whose happened somewhere before it started, and the 2 years between 1937 and 1939 hold a great many of them. When did the Second World War actually begin? And who was carrying it while Europe was still at peace? The answer changes, depending on which country you ask. Which is the problem? Chinese accounts date the war from 1937 and have for decades, and Western textbooks continue to date it from 1939. Somebody kept those divisions occupied for 8 years. Two of the largest combatant nations cannot agree on when the war began, and it has never been resolved because resolving it would change whose war it was. Number 10. Changde and the paper that was signed. Number 1. Changde and the paper that was signed. In 1943, 8,000 Chinese soldiers held a walled city against an army, using weapons banned by treaty. What the defenders of Changde were subjected to would tear apart everything the post-war world was told about how the war criminals of Asia were dealt with. The Japanese 11th Army attacked Changde with roughly 60,000 men. The city was held by the 57th Division of the Chinese National Revolutionary Army, about 8,000 strong. The defense lasted 16 days of house-to-house fighting. When Chinese relief forces reached the city, the defending division had been reduced to a figure usually given as a few hundred men. A few hundred out of 8,000 is not a costly defense, not a unit worn down over a campaign, not a formation withdrawn and rebuilt because it was destroyed where it stood. Not a defeat because the city was retaken, and not a battle in any English general history of the war. War crimes in Asia are understood through the Tokyo trials, and the trials are how the period is taught. The tribunal sat from 1946 to 1948, indicted 28 men, and convicted 25. 7 were hanged. The proceedings established a record of aggression, of the treatment of prisoners, and of the conduct of the war in Asia, and that record is the one that entered the histories. Justice was seen to be done, imperfectly and slowly, and the matter was understood to be closed. The weapons used at Changde were never prosecuted. Japanese forces employed chemical agents in the China theater repeatedly and by policy, and Changde is among the engagements where use of biological agents has been alleged and documented in later testimony taken under oath. The material that would have proved it in a courtroom was in the hands of Unit 731, and that material did not go to the Tokyo Tribunal. It went to the United States, in exchange for immunity from prosecution for the men who had produced it, and from there to the American Biological Weapons Program. No chemical or biological warfare charge was brought at Tokyo. No Japanese officer was tried for what was used in China. The Soviet trials at Khabarovsk in 1949 convicted 12 men and were dismissed in the West at the time as propaganda. No indictment on those charges anywhere. No testimony taken. No exhibits entered. No finding of fact by any court the West recognized, then or at any point since. Somebody held that city for 16 days. Somebody used those weapons on the men holding it. Somebody signed the paper that made both facts unusable in a courtroom. The men who held the city vanished twice over, which is what makes this the last item, rather than one more. The 57th Division was destroyed defending Changde, and its commander was court-martialed afterward for having withdrawn before relief arrived, then reinstated when the facts were looked at again. The division was nationalist, and after 1949 nationalist units disappeared from mainland commemoration entirely for the better part of half a century. So the soldiers were erased by the government that replaced their own. The crimes committed against them were erased by a deal signed in Washington, and the battle itself was erased from Western accounts by the general absence of the China theater. 3 separate erasures, from 3 directions, arriving at the same silence. Not one required the others, and no 2 of them were coordinated with each other. Each was somebody solving a separate problem, and the 3 solutions happened to intersect on the same 8,000 men. What is the record of a war actually made of, if a battle can be removed independently by the enemy that fought it, by the government that replaced the defenders, and by the ally that traded away the evidence? And how would anybody reading the account that remains ever be able to tell what is gone? Nobody reading it can tell, which is what erasure means when it works. Changde is recoverable only because Chinese records, Japanese unit histories, and American declassification each kept a different fragment by accident. Somebody signed the paper. 8,000 men held a city against weapons no court has ruled on, and almost every account of the war leaves them out. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.